deep within the jagged cliffs and scorched sands near the Dead Sea. A mystery resurfaced, an artifact not of gold or gem, but of words, dust, and time. The Book of Melchizedek, as it came to be called, was not merely a text but a living pulse of ancient thought, rescued from oblivion by fate or perhaps by divine intent. It was not discovered in a pristine library, nor protected by scholars, but buried half-rotted, half-redeemed within a forgotten chamber carved into salt-bitten stone. There, beneath centuries of silence, it waited. Legends speak of Melchizedek not only as a priest or king but as something more elusive, a gatekeeper between worlds, a bridge between mortal comprehension and celestial law. The book attributed to his name bears no ordinary marks of scripture. It is a lighthouse flickering across the stormy sea of human ignorance, casting brief, trembling beams into the night of collective amnesia. It does not preach, it whispers, its pages bleed ink like veins, pulsing with secrets that civilizations have buried, burned, or forbidden. The texture of the book itself, its leather warped by brine, its ink faded yet defiantly legible, seems a paradox. In one line, it recounts empires long before the flood. In the next, it murmurs of stars not yet born. There are no clear boundaries in its language. Myth bleeds into memory, prophecy into poetry, and the sacred into the damned. Scholars and mystics alike have claimed that reading even fragments of the book evokes a feeling of displacement, as if time itself folds inward. Some report lucid dreams of towering cities made of light and bone. Others speak of a great voice echoing in their minds, not in any known tongue, but understood all the same. What makes this text so haunting is not merely what it says, but what it dares to suggest, that much of what humanity knows is either incomplete or intentionally altered. Within its passages are stories of gods long erased from temple walls and heroes whose names have been scarred from the tongues of men. There is a passage that recounts a war waged not on earth, but across the spheres above, where beings of light and shadow tore at each other in silence. Their struggle mirrored later in our myths as battles between angels and devils, titans and gods. But Melchizedek's book does not cater to mere curiosity. It challenges the reader to endure discomfort. Its tales are not always coherent by modern logic, but therein lies their strange power. One section describes a city of mirrors, where each inhabitant sees not their own reflection, but the soul they most fear becoming. Another fragment speaks of a river that runs both forward and backward through time, and of those who drowned in it, cursed to remember the future. More disturbing still are the prophecies, curled like sleeping snakes between the tales. They do not name dates, nor offer salvation, but instead present veiled warnings of a silence that will one day descend upon the human race, of a great forgetting that has already begun. These are not predictions in the traditional sense, but reflections of an inevitable return of cycles that twist back to beginnings long ignored. The book hints that history is not linear, but spiral, coiling tighter with each epoch until the center collapses. What separates the Book of Melchizedek from other esoteric works is its refusal to offer certainty. It does not seek to convert, but to provoke. It does not define truth, but fractures it, inviting readers to piece it back together using their own soul as glue. For some, this is too much. There are documented cases of readers becoming obsessed, unable to read anything else, sketching glyphs from the book on walls, muttering to themselves in forgotten dialects. Others experience a profound peace, claiming to have touched a sliver of the divine. Among occult circles, the book is often considered alive not in the metaphorical sense, but quite literally. Anecdotes abound of its pages rearranging themselves, of certain passages revealing themselves only when the reader is ready. There is even speculation that multiple versions exist simultaneously, not due to copying or translation, but because the book adapts itself to the consciousness of the reader. What is heresy to one becomes scripture to another. Even the act of finding the book recovered near the Dead Sea, in a cavern sealed by salt and silence, feels like part of a larger ritual. Some claim the location is no coincidence, that it lies near where ancient prophets once walked, and where celestial battles were fought not with swords, but with frequencies and will. It is said the book was hidden there not to protect it from time, but to protect time from it. And so, the Book of Melchizedek stands as both relic and riddle, a monument to forgotten epochs and unseen truths. Its pages are neither sacred nor profane, they are something older than those distinctions. In a world increasingly obsessed with speed, clarity, and control, this book remains defiantly ambiguous, a siren song to those who sense that true knowledge is not always found in answers, but in the questions we dare to carry into the dark. To read it is to risk transformation. To dismiss it is to remain comfortably asleep. And perhaps that is its most subversive secret, that the divine is not out there, cloaked in fire or lightning, but hidden within us, aching to be remembered. The air was thick with the scent of dust and prophecy when the message reached Abraham. Far from the opulent cities and the thrones of kings, his life had been one of wandering, of watching over flocks and following the whispers of a God unseen, but ever present. He was a man of peace, not by weakness but by sacred design. Conflict repelled him, and the thought of bloodshed turned his heart heavy. But the message that arrived pierced through even his deepest convictions. There had been a great conflict in the valley, one that had ensnared many tribes and clans. Among the captives taken by foreign kings was Lot, Abraham's nephew, a boy he had raised as his own after his brother As passing. The cry was not only familial, it was divine. The voice of the Lord, subtle yet undeniable, pressed into Abraham's spirit. Rescue them. You will not be alone. This was no ordinary command. For Abraham, who had never wielded a sword in conquest, the thought of war was alien. His household was not a militia. His people were herders, craftsmen, seekers of the sky. Yet, as with all things given by the divine, the command carried within it the provision for fulfillment. Abraham withdrew into the sacred grove where he often spoke with the Lord. There, under the stars that had once been promised to him as descendants, he received a vision. The Lord instructed him to summon his shepherds, those loyal, dusty-footed men who had wandered with him through wilderness and famine. But more than a call to arms, it was a call to consecration. These were not warriors trained by hand, but souls to be sanctified by flame. Abraham obeyed. He sent word throughout his encampment and beyond. Within days, 600 shepherds stood before him, not with swords, but with open hands and unwavering eyes. These men were not chosen for strength or skill, but for their hearts. Each one was to be purified, marked not by weapons, but by sacrifice. Then came the vessel. Among Abraham's belongings was a large clay jar, cracked yet curiously whole. It had been given to him by a desert stranger who vanished without a trace. Speaking of a time when the jar would contain the breath of heaven, now, the Lord revealed its purpose. Abraham was told to pour sacred oil into the vessel. The oil was drawn from the oldest olives, pressed under moonlight, and mixed with crushed myrrh and desert spices. Into this mixture, he was to place tufts of wool shorn from the choicest lambs, each soaked in prayer. From the wool, he fashioned a long wick, winding it into the depths of the jar. This would be no ordinary fire, for the wick itself was to be lit by the flame of the altar, the eternal fire that burned in Abraham's holy space, where offerings had long ascended to heaven. On the appointed night, under a sky thick with starlight and silence, the 600 stood gathered. Each man had fasted, bathed, and clothed himself in robes without seam. Abraham approached the altar. The fire there had never known kindling, only divine spark, sustained through generations. With trembling hands, he drew from the holy blaze and touched the tip of the wick. In that moment, the jar did not merely light, it ignited, but it did not burn with the violence of ordinary flame. Instead, the fire shimmered like liquid gold, rising without smoke, humming with a sound not of this world. The light danced in rhythms that echoed with ancient songs, songs the stars themselves seemed to know. Every shepherd present fell to his knees. Some wept, some sang, others simply gazed. Struck speechless, they knew then, without question, that they had been changed. The fire did not consume. It consecrated. It wrapped itself around their spirits, etching unseen marks upon their souls. In their hands they still carried no weapons, but something stronger: purpose. In their eyes there flickered the reflection of that holy flame, as though each had become a torch in his own right. Abraham looked upon them and saw not sheep herders, but vessels of divine will. The Lord whispered again, "Go now. My presence walks before you." And so began the great rescue, though the chapters that follow would detail the confrontation, the miraculous strategies, the trembling of enemy camps at the sight of firelit men moving through the darkness. It was not the battle itself that made history tremble, but the spirit in which it was waged. Abraham did not march in pride or vengeance. He walked with humility and awe, each step echoing the command he had received and the flame he carried. When he and his company reached the captors, no sword was drawn at first. The enemy saw the light approaching and mistook it for a celestial omen. Some fled, some fell to their knees, and some, in madness or fear, struck, but their blows faltered against the divine protection that shielded Abraham's chosen. Lot and the other captives were found shackled and weary. They wept when they saw the deliverers, not just for the rescue, but for the light that followed them, the fire that did not burn but healed. Even the foreign kings who had taken them could not deny what they had seen. Abraham did not kill them. He released them with a warning: "This is not my victory, but the Lord's. Let your hearts be turned, for next time the fire will not spare." By the time Abraham and his people returned, the flame in the vessel had not dimmed. It remained steady, quiet, as if resting. The 600 returned changed, not by bloodshed, but by sacred purpose. Many would never speak of what they had seen in the fire, visions of ancient places, voices calling from the firmament, the feeling of being known by something far older than time. What had begun as a rescue became something more, a revelation. Abraham's name would be remembered not only for his covenant, but for this great deliverance, in which peace wore the armor of holy fire, and simple shepherds became vessels of divine might. The Book of Melchizedek would later recount this not as legend, but as sacred memory, preserving in its mysterious pages the moment when heaven leaned down through a jar of oil and wool, and lit a fire no darkness could extinguish. The morning Abraham set out, the horizon was pale and quiet, as if creation itself was holding its breath. On his shoulder rested the jar, the bun churi, the vessel of deliverance, its ancient clay still warm from the flame that lived within. He could feel the weight of it, not just in his bones, but in his soul. This was no ordinary burden. It pulsed softly with a presence he dared not define, a mystery that whispered of things beyond comprehension. He did not tell many where he was going. How could he? The Lord had not given him a destination, only a direction. Forward. The fire would guide him, and he must guard it. What waited ahead was not told to him, only that he must walk and trust. Few understood. Many mocked. "You carry a pot as if it were a crown." One man jeered. "He walks into the wilderness with a jar of fire." Another scoffed, shaking his head. "A prophet or a madman." Even those closest to him were troubled. Sarah, the woman who had shared his trials and his tents, wept when he departed. "Why must you chase shadows?" she asked, voice cracking with pain. "Is not your God here among us? Must you vanish into the night like a ghost?" Abraham had no answers that satisfied the world. The path of faith rarely makes sense to those who have not heard the call. So he walked alone, with the fire flickering softly inside the jar, whispering its strange heat against the cold winds of dawn. There were days when the path stretched endlessly across barren hills and dry wadis. The dust clung to his feet like doubt. He often found himself speaking aloud, not in prayer, but in pleading. Am I truly called to this? Did I not misunderstand? There was no voice in return, only the wind and the soft flicker of flame. At night, when the cold settled in and the stars wheeled silently above him, Abraham would place the jar beside him and stare into its light. The flame did not waver. If anything, it grew brighter against the dark. It was not fed by oil alone, there was something eternal in its burn. Something unquenchable. And slowly, Abraham began to understand. This flame was not merely a miracle. It was a sign. A presence. A promise. The fire represented not just guidance but embodiment of future, where divinity would no longer dwell above, distant and hidden, but with us. Emmanuel, God among men. He began to call the fire the light of the coming one. And though he did not yet know the name that would one day be spoken in secret by angels and shouted on street corners by zealots, he felt its gravity in his chest. The fire in the jar was the beginning of something vast and sacred, a Messiah not yet revealed, but already moving. And so he walked, guarding the flame with his body when the wind turned cruel, shielding it from dust and rain. There were times when the cold was so sharp it bit through his bones, and he feared the fire would go out, but it never did. In fact, the darker the world became, the brighter the flame seemed to shine. Its light cut through the night like a sword, gentle but fierce. And as the days turned to weeks, a strange thing began to happen. From hillsides and dry valleys, flocks of sheep stray. Untended, wild began to follow him. At first it was a single ewe. Limping, lost, then two more, then a dozen. They made no sound, simply walking behind him as though drawn not to the man, but to the jar on his shoulder. By the time Abraham reached the lowlands near the direction of Sodom, he was no longer alone. Behind him walked a silent procession of sheep, pure, white, moving as one. It was as though creation itself had recognized the path he walked. These creatures, once scattered and fearful, had found in the fire a shepherd greater than Abraham. Looking back at them one evening, Abraham felt tears rise unexpectedly. They were not tears of sorrow, but of awe. Even the beasts understand. He thought. Even they feel the pull of something holy. The mockery he once heard faded into memory, replaced by the silence of sacred journeying. Abraham no longer feared the doubts. He had wrestled with loneliness, yes, but now he knew that solitude could be sanctuary. The fire was not only alive, it watched. It listened, and in its warmth, he was never truly alone. Still, trials came. Harsh storms lashed the desert one night, and Abraham feared the jar would be torn from him by the wind. He wrapped it tightly, shielding it with his cloak, his own body trembling as he huddled beneath a jagged outcrop of rock. He whispered to it not in fear, but in love. You are not mine, but I am yours. I will carry you until I fall. And then, may the earth carry you farther. When morning broke and the flame still burned, undimmed, he understood. The journey was no longer about rescue alone, nor even obedience. It was becoming transformation. With every step he took, with every moment the fire lived on, the world was being reshaped softly, quietly, in ways no army could achieve. He thought of the ancient promises, the stars, the sand, the covenant made under heaven's open eye. He saw now that all of it pointed toward this moment. Not the jar, not even the fire, but what it meant. A God not content to remain above. A God who would come down, clothed not in smoke and thunder, but in light that heals, in presence that walks. When he finally glimpsed the plains of Sodom in the distance, he knew that his journey had just begun. The city lay ahead, yes, with its corruption and cruelty, but so too did the next chapter of the fire's story. Abraham had become more than a man with a mission. He had become a carrier of prophecy, a bearer of light in a world desperate for dawn. And behind him, the flock moved on, silent, faithful, drawn not by instinct, but by mystery. When the time came, Abraham stood atop a low ridge, the jar still steady on his shoulder, and looked out over the darkened valley below. The enemy's camp lay sprawled in the distance, flickering with scattered torches and the muffled clatter of arrogance. Beneath the veil of night, there was no trumpet of war, no iron-plated army ready to charge, only quiet figures slowly gathering, like shadows guided by one unwavering light. The faithful had returned, 300 shepherds, lean from travel and sun, dusty from wilderness paths, now circled him with eyes that no longer feared. They had come not for spoils or conquest, but because they had learned to love the light. Since the day Abraham had set out with the jar, its flame had become more than a symbol, it had become their teacher, their compass, their reason. These were not soldiers bred in courts or trained by generals. They were men who once counted sheep, now counting the hours until the promise unfolded. They were quiet and watchful, bonded not by blood but by fire. They had learned the rhythm of silence, the pulse of obedience. They no longer questioned why a jar glowed or why the flame inside did not consume. They only believed. Abraham moved among them, the fire casting soft gold upon their faces. 1-1. They carried staffs, ordinary wooden rods, save for what now adorned them. At his instruction, each man had soaked tufts of lamb's wool in sacred oil, wound them tightly around the tips of their staffs, and concealed them within smaller jars, carried carefully at their side. These were no mere tools. They were vessels of light, slumbering until the hour of revelation. Then came the voice. It did not echo like thunder nor crash like cymbals. It rose from the flame, soft but absolute, not in words of any human tongue, but in knowing. Abraham closed his eyes as the fire whispered strategy into his heart, and the rhythm of the plan settled into him as surely as breath. They were to encircle the enemy silently. Torches hidden, breath still. Each man would carry a jar in his left hand and a ram's horn in his right. No torch was to be lit until the sign came, the extinguishing of one lamp among the captives. For the enemy, triumphant and unaware, the camp was calm. Songs and drunken shouts rose in distant patches of firelight. They believed the land was theirs. The captives among them Lot were held in a low wooden enclosure, guarded, wary, silent. One among them, an old man from the eastern tribe, had been given a small oil lamp to tend the others. It was with this man that the signal would come. Abraham had not explained how. He only told them, "Watch. When the lamp dies, it begins." The shepherds spread out in groups of 100, circling the slopes above the valley. The torches, soaked and ready, slept inside their jars. The horns, old and polished, waited in silence. Then, without fanfare, the lamp in the captive's pen flickered once and went out. It was as though the darkness took a sudden breath. Abraham lifted his eyes, took in the valley one final time, and raised his hand. In one swift motion, each man shattered his jar, and the fire roared to life. In every direction, flames burst forth, a storm of golden light erupting across the hills like stars falling to earth. The torches blazed against the sky, each a testimony of purpose awakened. And before the enemy could lift a sword or shout a command, the shepherds raised their horns. The sound that followed was not of war, but of heaven breaking in. 300 trumpets screamed across the valley, shattering sleep, scattering order. The sound was piercing, pure, terrifying. It rolled through the enemy camp like thunder set loose, echoing off rock and skin alike. Men awoke to fire on all sides, their camp surrounded by phantom flames. Panic was immediate. Chaos bloomed like wildfire. They saw torches but no army. They heard horns but no marching feet. Shadows flickered between tents. The enemy, drunk and disoriented, turned on each other, convinced they were under siege by a great and invisible force. Blades clashed in the dark. Brother cut down brother. Commanders fell to their own guards. Screams rose into the night, mingling with the roar of horns that refused to stop. The shepherds did not descend. They only watched, holding the line of fire in perfect formation, the light unbroken. The flame in Abraham's jar remained lit, its reflection gleaming in his eyes. It was not rage that filled him, it was awe. The fire fights for itself, he thought, as dawn edged across the sky. The valley below lay still. Thousands had fallen in madness and fear. Those who survived had fled, running blindly into the hills, leaving behind their weapons. their tents, their captives. The shepherds began their descent only when the silence settled. The captives were unharmed, wide-eyed with disbelief. Lot stood at the edge of the pen, tears staining his cheeks. He rushed into Abraham's arms without a word. Overcome. Around them, the remaining enemies were gathered not in battle, but surrender. The shepherds, without blood on their hands, led them in chains through the valley now hallowed by miracle. The victory was total, but no victory Abraham had ever imagined. It was not steel that had won the night, but obedience. Not violence, but vision. The fire had led them, spoken to them, protected them. Now, it revealed the cost of pride and the triumph of light. When the sun rose fully, Abraham stood again on the ridge, the jar at his side. The flame still burned, steady and soft, as if untouched by the night's fury. He raised it high, and the people below, captives, shepherds, enemies alike, turned their faces toward it. There were no songs of war, only the wind, carrying with it the quiet echo of 300 trumpets that once cried out not just for battle, but for awakening. The fire had done what no army could. It had revealed the truth. That light, when carried with faith and broken in obedience, becomes a force that even darkness cannot comprehend. The morning after the great deliverance, as the smoke of confusion still lingered over the battlefield, and the cries of fear had faded into silence, Abraham stood once again beneath the rising sun. The valley below bore the marks of judgment, yet above it all, there was peace, solemn, stirring, prophetic. It was not merely a victory over flesh and blood. Something deeper had taken place, something beyond time. In his heart, Abraham knew this rescue was not just for the sake of Lot, nor merely for the preservation of the captives. It was a shadow of what was to come, a glimpse into a final liberation not yet fulfilled. As he watched the people slowly gather, some with trembling gratitude, others with dazed expressions of survival, he felt the stirring of a greater vision. This moment was not the end. It was a signpost pointing toward the last days, when Israel would once again cry out, and the heavens would answer. And then it struck him. The day of the rescue had not been ordinary. It had occurred on Rosh Hashanah, the day of trumpets, the beginning of the new year, the day when the shofar was blown to awaken the soul, to call for repentance, to declare that God alone is king. How could it be coincidence? 300 trumpets had cried out that night, not just in strategy, but in proclamation. The rescue had been a rehearsal and echo of the final deliverance, when the King of Glory would once again lead captives out of darkness, not with swords, but with fire and light. Abraham, filled with trembling awe, called the people together by a stream that wound softly near the edge of the valley. He lifted his voice not as a commander, but as a prophet, and invited those who had been rescued to enter the waters. "Come," he said. "You have been saved not only with your lives, but with mercy. Wash yourselves, not just your skin, but your hearts. Be made new, for the Lord has passed over you." Yet only 3 stepped forward. Lot, wary but tender-eyed, came first. He said nothing, only knelt. Behind him, his 2 daughters followed. The others remained where they were, silent, hesitant, uncertain. They had seen miracles, but their hearts were still entangled with the comforts and customs of Sodom. To bathe in these waters meant to turn from what they had known, and that, for many, was too great a cost. Abraham lowered the 3 into the stream one by one. The water was cold, but as each emerged, a quiet brightness seemed to rest upon their faces. It was not glory as the world knew it, but something gentler, a new beginning. Abraham wept, not from sorrow, but from a deep ache. He longed for all of them to choose life, but he knew the heart of man was stubborn. Even miracles could not bend it without willingness. Soon after, a delegation came from the defeated king of Sodom, bearing gifts, gold, silver, fine cloth, spices. They bowed low before Abraham and offered him riches in thanks for his rescue. But Abraham looked upon their treasures and saw emptiness. He remembered the flame, the purity of its light, the silence of its obedience. He could not defile it with the greed of fallen kings. I lift my hand before the Lord, possessor of heaven and earth. Abraham declared, and I swear I will not take even a thread or a sandal strap from you, lest you say, I made Abraham rich. The delegation left, bewildered, their hands still full. That evening, as the sun dipped low and cast golden hues over the hills, Abraham led the people north, toward Salem, the city of peace. There, in a grove adorned with woven tents and branches, they prepared to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. It was not yet commanded as law, but something in Abraham's spirit recognized the timing. The people had wandered. They had been delivered. Now they were to dwell temporarily in shelters, rejoicing in the mercy of God and the protection of His presence. They laid out mats beneath the stars. Fires flickered in small circles. Food was shared. Songs hummed. Children laughed. But the greatest joy came as Abraham brought forth the jar, the same vessel that had once carried the sacred flame. The fire was no longer there. Its light had fulfilled its purpose. It had burned until the last trumpet, until the last captive was freed. Now, within the jar, resting softly in its curved basin, were small pearls, round, luminous, pure. No one knew how they had formed. Abraham did not place them there. They had simply appeared after the fire went out, as if left behind by the flame's final breath. Abraham lifted the jar, now cool to the touch, and turned it gently in the light of the lanterns. The pearls caught the glow and sparkled. The people gathered around, watching with wide eyes. Then someone whispered, "They are the tears of salvation." Abraham smiled. He said, "They are its promise." The pearls were unlike any found in the sea. They held within them something invisible, like joy unspoken, like a future not yet written but already secure. They became the new treasure of the people, not for adornment, but remembrance. The jar no longer carried fire, but it carried testimony. It was passed from tent to tent that night, each person holding it close, not in possession, but in reverence. They danced late into the night, not on stone or sand, but upon the sacred ground where the jar rested, ground that shimmered faintly. Some said, as if the fire had not fully left. They called it the dance of the pearls, and every step was a declaration that deliverance was not only real, but still to come. The air rang with laughter and song, with gratitude and hope. No trumpet sounded now, but the rhythm of joy was louder than battle. And above it all, the stars watched, the same stars that had once heard God whisper to Abraham, "Count them, if you can, so shall your descendants be." That night, they shimmered brighter, as if echoing the truth that salvation, once begun, does not end. It multiplies. Abraham stood at the edge of the camp, holding the jar close to his heart. He no longer wept. He no longer feared. The flame had gone, yes, but in its place remained a promise. He understood now that the fire was never meant to stay forever. It had come to lead, to deliver, and to leave behind a seed of what was to come. He looked toward the horizon, where night met dawn, and smiled. The Messiah had not yet come, but he had walked among them in the flame, in the rescue, in the dance, and when the final trumpet would one day sound, Abraham knew he would hear it and rise. When Abraham and his people entered the gates of Salem, it was as if they had stepped out of time and into a dream. The dust of battle still clung to their garments, and the memory of deliverance was fresh in their hearts. But Salem, this city of peace, seemed untouched by the harsh rhythms of the world. There were no walls bristling with spears, no towers for archers, no clang of iron. Instead, music floated on the air, lutes and flutes, voices singing in harmony, and the very stones of the city seemed to hum with light. Salem was ruled not by force, but by song. Its people were trained not in war, but in harmony. Children learned to pluck strings before they were taught to wield tools. Every citizen knew their part in the symphony of peace. At the heart of the city stood a man unlike any Abraham had ever seen. He was young, yet ancient in presence, clothed not in royal garments of blood and conquest, but in simple robes of white and blue, with a golden lyre slung across his back. His name was Melchizedek. He met Abraham at the gates without guards, without fear, his steps light and unhurried, with eyes clear as morning and voice steady like a mountain breeze. He said, "Blessed are you, Abram, servant of Elion God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth." At that moment, Abraham bowed deeply. It was not a gesture born of politics or courtesy, but reverence. He felt it in his bones. This was no ordinary king. Melchizedek was both priest and ruler, chosen not by men, but appointed from a realm beyond the visible. In the quiet joy of Salem, Abraham knew he stood before the one who bore the seal of eternity. From that day forward, Abraham honored Melchizedek as priest of the Most High God. In the days that followed, Melchizedek hosted a great feast for the returning band. Not a feast of excess or drunkenness, but of sacred joy. Tables were laid with fresh fruits, fine bread, and sweet wine pressed from the vineyards of the valley. The people of Salem danced with the travelers. The music of lyres, flutes, and bells filled every courtyard. But the most sacred moment came when Melchizedek began the ceremony of crowns. 1:1. Beginning with Lot and his daughters, Melchizedek placed upon their heads a crown not of gold, but of woven branches and silver thread, each one adorned with a single pearl. These were not trophies, but tokens of victory through obedience and light. With each crown laid, he whispered a blessing in a language none could name, but all understood in their hearts. When Abraham knelt, Melchizedek paused. He took Abraham's hands in his, and for the first time, Abraham saw them, deep scars etched across both palms, thin and shining like fire healed over. They were not the wounds of battle. They were too precise, too sacred. Abraham looked up, and Melchizedek held his gaze with gentle gravity. "These," he said softly, "are not for now, but one day. I will tell you everything." Abraham said nothing. He only nodded, his heart pounding with the weight of unspoken prophecy. Somehow, he understood. These scars were not Melchizedek's alone. They belonged to the one who was to come, the Lamb, the servant, the flame made flesh. And though the time was not yet, the truth glimmered just beneath the veil. Then came the offering. Abraham brought forth the jar that once carried the sacred flame, now filled with the pearls that had appeared after the great deliverance. He placed it before Melchizedek, bowed low, and said, "A tenth of all I carry belongs to the Most High." The jar was opened and carefully counted. There were 1,440 pearls, pure, radiant, unlike any the sea could offer. From them, 144 were set aside as the tithe, each one chosen with care. Melchizedek held the first in his hand and lifted it into the sun. "This," he said, "it is a witness." He then turned to Abraham and the shepherds, and with great clarity declared, "You shall tell this story, the story of the jar and its flame, for 6 years. Go throughout the lands. Speak of the fire that does not burn, of the trumpet that awakens, of the rescue that came not by sword, but by light. Invite the people to take a pearl, not to possess it, but to carry it as a sign of rescue, a sign of belonging." And then his voice deepened. "But know this, after 6 years, the invitation ends. No more pearls will be given. The 7th year will come, and it will not be like the others." Silence fell over the gathering. Even the children stopped dancing. Melchizedek continued, "In that 7th year, there will be tribulation and judgment. Fire shall fall not from men, but from heaven. Cities of pride and rebellion will be consumed. Only those who carry the pearl will be protected, not because of the pearl itself, but because of what it represents, a soul turned toward the light. Abraham felt the wind stir, warm and strange, as if it carried with it the breath of a future not yet born. He looked down at the pearls, then back at Melchizedek. "Will they believe us?" he asked. Melchizedek smiled, but his eyes were solemn. "Some will. Some will laugh. Some will forget until it is too late." The next day, Abraham and his men prepared to leave Salem. They would become messengers now, not just witnesses. Each man took a pouch of pearls, and Melchizedek gave them words to speak, not scripted, but given like seeds to plant. "Let the story guide your speech," he said, "and trust the pearl to speak for itself." As they departed, the city of Salem shone behind them, its music fading, its gates wide open, its king still standing at the threshold, lyre in hand, scars on his palms, watching them disappear into the horizon. The journey ahead would be long. The world would not always receive them. But they walked with purpose. They carried the truth in the form of a pearl and the memory of a fire that once burned in a jar, a fire that still burned in their hearts. And Abraham knew that one day, far beyond their footsteps, in a time yet to come, the final trumpet would sound not from 300 mouths, but from the heavens, and the deliverer would return, not with warning, but with glory. Until then, they walked and they sang in the quiet sanctuary of Salem, under the twilight sky where stars whispered secrets to those who could hear. Melchizedek gathered Abraham and his companions for one final revelation. It was the 7th night since the feast, and though the music of lyres had softened, a deeper melody stirred beneath the surface, one that pulsed like prophecy through the bones of the earth. Melchizedek led them into the heart of his palace, not grand in the way of kings, but sacred in a way that made even the stones seem to hold their breath. At its center stood a circular courtyard, open to the heavens, ringed with towering columns, 40 in total, white as moonlight, vined with gold. He raised a single pearl from Abraham's offering, holding it aloft beneath the stars. "You have brought 1,440 pearls," he said. "A tenth, 144, has been given to the Most High. Multiply these by the number of pillars in this palace, 40, and you will see the year when the great deliverance of Israel shall be complete." Abraham closed his eyes. 40 times 144, 5,760. Melchizedek continued, "This number is not merely a count of time, it is a sign, a mystery that shall be unveiled when the descendants of Jacob return to the one they have pierced. For there will come a day, unlike any before it, when their blindness will be lifted. They will look upon him whom they have wounded, and their hearts will break not in despair, but in awakening." The wind shifted as if echoing the truth. The columns of the palace shimmered in the dim light, casting long shadows like outstretched arms reaching toward a dawn still unseen. "There shall be war," Melchizedek said, voice resonant like a shofar. "A war not of swords alone, but of spirit and truth. The nations will rise in defiance against the covenant. They will seek to devour Zion. But in the midst of this darkness, a purification will come." He paused, and the air grew still. On the day of cleansing, the fire will not burn the faithful. It will refine them, and those who have accepted the pearl, those who have kept the light of the promise, will be washed anew. The Spirit of the Holy One will be poured out on all flesh. Sons and daughters shall prophesy. Old men will dream again. The veil shall be torn, and the breath of the Most High will fill every corner of the earth. Abraham's chest ached with hope and fear. He saw it in his mind, a world ablaze not with destruction, but with revelation, 1,000 voices rising in unity. The sound of chains breaking, the face of the wounded one shining like the sun. Melchizedek's eyes now glowed with a radiance that did not belong to any man. "The 6 years you have been given," he said, "are marked by the sanctification of the Sabbath. Each Sabbath is a reminder of the covenant arrest, a sign, a whisper of eternity. Those who honor it will walk under the covering of the Most High. Those who mock it will be swept away by the tide. Abraham remembered the joy of those Sabbaths in Salem, the singing of children, the breaking of bread, the peace that surpassed all understanding. It was more than ritual, it was alignment with heaven. And when the 6 years pass, Melchizedek said, and the 7th begins, the veil between heaven and earth shall tremble. In the fullness of that 7th year, Jerusalem will rise again, not as it was, but as it was always meant to be. The new Jerusalem will descend, not made by human hands, but carved from glory. It will shine with light no sun can provide. And in its midst will be the throne of the Lamb. Tears slipped down Abraham's face. He saw it not with his eyes, but with something deeper, a city of gold and jasper, gates made of single pearls, rivers of life, trees bearing fruit for healing. In that moment, Melchizedek continued, the Messiah shall appear in the heavens, not as a suffering servant, but as the King of Kings. The dead will rise, the faithful of old. The prophets, the martyrs, those who have clung to the pearl in times of trial, and the living, whose hearts burn with the same light, shall be transformed. In the twinkling of an eye, they will be clothed in incorruptible glory. He gestured to the sky above the courtyard, where the stars now seemed to align into unseen patterns. And they shall meet him in the air, not in fear, but in victory. And he shall lead them to Jerusalem the new, where the coronation will take place. Each shall receive a crown not of silver or gold, but of fire and joy. And there shall be no more death, no more tears, only song, only light. A hush fell upon the courtyard, deeper than silence. Abraham turned to his companions. Their faces were glowing not with fire, but with purpose. They had seen beyond the veil. They knew now what the pearl meant. It was not treasure, it was destiny. Melchizedek lowered the pearl and placed it back in the jar. This is the final revelation, he said. What you carry is not only a testimony of the past, but a glimpse of the end of days. Guard it well. Speak of it truly. Let the story go before you like a lamp on a dark path. Then he did something no one expected. He knelt before Abraham. You have been faithful, he said. Go now, messenger of the Most High. You are no longer just a father of nations. You are a witness of the kingdom to come. Abraham lifted him gently. No more words were needed. They stood together, two men, two callings beneath a sky swollen with prophecy. And then the wind rose, carrying the scent of incense and myrrh. Somewhere in the city, a lyre began to play again. And as the sound grew, Abraham and his companions turned their faces to the road once more. The time of harvest had begun, and they would not walk alone. After the revelations in Salem and the solemn blessing from Melchizedek, Abraham felt the weight of a new mission settle upon his shoulders, a mission not of conquest, but of proclamation. With the jar of pearls secured and the memory of the sacred fire still alive in his heart, he and his faithful shepherds departed to spread what they now understood to be a message of redemption. Their voices, once reserved for the bleating of sheep and songs around fires, now carried the profound story of the vessel and the flame, a parable of salvation hidden within the most ordinary of things. Wherever they traveled, across hills, through valleys, to the tents of kin and strangers, alike they spoke of the great deliverance and the pearl of rescue. They told of the fire in the clay jar, how it gave light in the darkness and confused the enemy. They spoke of the moment the vessel was shattered and the light revealed, how the oppressors fell to confusion, and how only those with the flame were saved. They explained that each pearl within the jar was a symbol of salvation offered freely, a light for every soul, a treasure from heaven not earned by works but received in faith. Some listened, many did not. Back in their camp, Abraham's own household gathered to hear the tale, but among the curious faces, one remained distant, Sarah, his wife. She watched as Abraham opened the jar and showed the pearls. He offered her one gently, his eyes full of warmth and longing. But she did not take it. These are beautiful, she said softly, examining the pearl he held out. "But what does it mean? Abraham, what is this flame you speak of?" "It is the presence of the one who delivers." Abraham replied, "The light that burns without consuming, the sign of our hope. Each pearl is a promise. Accepting it means trusting in what is yet unseen. But I am an old woman," she said, turning away. "My days of believing in unseen promises are gone. I have no son. I have no inheritance. You chase dreams from the stars while I count the wrinkles on my hands. What good is a pearl to a barren woman?" Her words cut deeper than she knew. Abraham lowered the pearl. He did not press her. That night, beneath the stars that once guided him from Ur, Abraham sat alone beside the jar of pearls. He did not question the vision, nor the fire, nor the covenant, but his heart grieved for Sarah. Could redemption truly reach even the heart closed by disappointment? The next morning, as the dawn painted the horizon in gold, a shadow fell upon the entrance to Abraham's tent. He looked up to see a familiar figure approaching Melchizedek. The King of Salem was not alone. With him walked 3 travelers, radiant in presence, yet cloaked in humility. One among them bore a stillness so deep, the air seemed to hush in reverence as he passed. Melchizedek took Abraham aside and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Your wife's doubt is not the end of her story," he said. "After 6 years have passed, the Lord himself will visit her. She will bear a son, and his name will be Isaac, which means laughter. Do not lose heart, for with God, even barren ground shall bring forth fruit." Abraham wept softly, the tears as much relief as faith. That evening, under the oaks of Mamre, Abraham prepared a meal for the 3 travelers. He recognized something in their bearing, a nobility not of men, but of the heavens. As they ate, one of them turned to Sarah, who stood listening just inside the tent. "Where is your wife, Sarah?" the traveler asked. "She is here," Abraham answered. The man looked toward the tent, his voice gentle yet resounding. "This time next year, she will hold a son in her arms." Sarah, hidden behind the curtain, laughed to herself a bitter sound, born of long hopes deferred. "Shall I now have this pleasure, when I am worn and old? After all these years?" But the man turned his gaze directly toward the tent. "Why did Sarah laugh?" he said. "Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time, she shall embrace her son." Sarah stepped into view. Startled, "I did not laugh," she whispered. Embarrassed. But he smiled not with rebuke, but with infinite patience. "Yes," he said, "you did laugh." There was no condemnation in his words, only invitation. Then he reached into his robe and withdrew 2 pearls, each glowing faintly with the light of dawn. "These are for you," he said, placing them in her hands. "One is for your soul, which struggles to believe. The other is for the child yet to be born. Carry them both. When the child arrives, you will know their meaning." Sarah stood still, the pearls warm against her skin. For the first time in many years, something stirred within her, a tenderness, a tremor, a flicker of hope she had long buried. She did not speak, but her eyes glistened, and she held the pearls close to her chest. Then the man turned to Abraham, and from his robe he brought out a single remaining pearl larger than the others, and purest in its light. "This is for you," he said. "The final pearl, the last sign." As Abraham accepted it, a peace unlike any he had known descended upon him. It was as if the heavens breathed upon his soul. The weight of years lifted. The promise felt nearer than ever before. "Who are you?" Abraham asked, though he already suspected. "I am the flame upon the altar," the traveler replied. "I am the one who was wounded for love. I am the key." And with that, the travelers departed. Abraham watched them go until they disappeared into the evening haze. Then he turned to Sarah. She was still holding the pearls. Her lips parted in wonder. She said nothing, but for the first time, she did not resist. In the days that followed, she began to speak of things long forgotten. She smiled more. She listened when Abraham told the story of the jar again. She touched her stomach sometimes, though it still showed no change. And every night, she held the pearl to her heart before sleeping. The story of the pearls continued to spread, not as a myth, but as a movement. And though many still scoffed, a growing number began to accept the light. Among them now was Sarah, no longer untouched by belief, but quietly carrying the mystery of life within her. And Abraham, having received the final pearl, knew the work was not finished. But the promise it was alive,